Vayechi. Okay, I think we're ready.
Oh, okay.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for waiting.
Thank you.
And it's back to Baruch Hashem, good old days. We need better days. Let's do even better. Make sure we're on the right page. Here we go. And it's time for 3-point Torah learning. It's good to be back. Parshas Vayechi. We've had so much since we learned last. We're going to talk about what's going on in the Parsha. Before that, we'll talk about what's going on in the calendar. Just to mention very briefly, we've missed Hanukkah in Shiurim wise, but I'm sure everyone's been learning so much on their own. We've also missed, we haven't spoken much about Hey Teves, which was just last week. Tremendously important day on the recent calendar, and that's the Yom Tov of the Sfarim, where everyone is encouraged to learn more Torah,
Mhm.
to fix any of the books that are in your house that might need fixing, and more importantly, even to buy more Yiddish books.
Mhm.
Fill your house with Yiddish books. It's the Yom Tov of the Sfarim. If I'm not mistaken, the grand sale is on till tonight. So if you haven't bought anything yet, it's not too late. It's good to have Sfarim. It's good to have more Sfarim. And if you're worried that you might not use them, get them first, and we'll deal with that problem later. Back to the point at hand, what's going this week in the calendar. And there's big things to be said of what's happening in the calendar, even before we mention Parsha. And that is that tonight, Monday night, Tuesday, will be Asara B'Teves, the 10th day of the month of Teves, which is a very big date on the Yiddish calendar. Although today, the calendars say that it's a sad day. It's a day where we fast. And it's a day where we're not looking to diet and refrain from eating in order to lose weight. We're refraining from eating starting from tomorrow morning here in Manchester at 6:20, I think 6:21, all the way to 4:41. Is the shortest fast in the book when it comes to this side of the world. But it's all about remembering the beginning of the calamities that befell Yerushalayim of old. It is actually the first Beis Hamikdash, and where Melech Bavel, the king of Bavel, surrounded the whole city of Yerushalayim in his latest siege that lasted for years, in which he weakened and weakened Yerushalayim. So until eventually, when it came time to break through the walls, the people inside Yerushalayim were very weakened. And unfortunately, a big part of that was because of the infighting that was taking place within Yerushalayim, the lack of unity. But Melech Bavel, the king of Babel, who surrounded and laid siege in Yerushalayim, started on this day of Asar B'Teves. And as the Rebbe points out, that the word Chazal used to describe the siege is Samach Melech Bavel. The king of Bavel, surrounded the city using the letter Samach, which is drawn as a circle, as a description of what a siege might look like. And of course, the Rebbe points out that the word Samach, it means a circle, but it also can mean the word lismoich, to rely or to depend or to support. And in this sense, the deeper understanding is that the king of Bavel, although he was a nasty fellow, was actually Hashem's agent in supporting Yerushalayim. In which way? That he had started the war, yet nobody got hurt. At that stage of the war, where there was a siege around Yerushalayim, not a shot had been fired. There were soldiers all around, but at the same time, the war had begun. It was a very, very serious time, and it would have been a great time for the Yiddish people to realize that at a time like that, it was very opportune to turn ourselves around, and especially in the first place in English, the three cardinal sins would have been something we should have done well of trying to change the tide, but unfortunately we didn't. And that would have been the perfect time to turn around with such a stark reminder, yet nobody had been hurt. And in that sense, Samach Melech Bavel, the support of the king of Bavel, was exactly that, that the Yiddish people had the reminder without the need for anyone to get hurt. And this is important for us as well, because there are reminders that are popping up, and the goal of these reminders are to support us, to help us, to encourage us to turn around our tide and to pick up the message and be able to strengthen ourselves. And that's really the reason why we fast on Asar B'Teves year in, year out, because we're going to try to use this special opportunity of a day to be able to turn the tide. which is why the Rambam talks about these 4 fast days that commemorate the calamities of Yerushalayim as Yahaf Yom Mela, quoting the Pasuk. These are the days that will be turned into the greatest Yomim Tovim, including tonight and tomorrow, this big important day on the calendar, the day that began such calamities. Once it's turned around, will actually become a day of tremendous rejoicing, and that's a Asar B'Tevis, one of those big days. It's so big, it's actually in a way even bigger than the others, although Tisha B'Av is the saddest day. Shiva Asava Tammuz, the 17th Tammuz, it's not far behind that. But Asar B'Tevis, which is a half year earlier, but is the day where it began. And that is big. When something begins, it's the starting point, and the starting point is very big. And that's the time we are in right now. So it's tremendously energized time. It's a time that can give us the ability to turn the tide, and we're going to try with all our intentions and all our abilities to be able to actually use this special time that we're starting in already. That's one big deal on this week's calendar. Another big thing is this Shabbos. We haven't spoken about Parshas Vayechi, but it happens to be that Parshas Vayechi is the final Parsha in the whole Sefer Bereshis, which makes this Shabbos Chazak. And Shabbos Chazak is a big deal because as we speak every time we have Chazak, it's 5 times a year, or at least 4 of them we speak about, because the 5th one is on Simchas Torah. But it's the first one again, the first Chazak, V'nis Chazek. And the announcement we make in Shul is be strong, and strengthen each other. Because when we stand together with the power of Torah, that is the greatest strength that we have. Ein oiz ela Torah, and kihem chayenu, Torah is our power. Torah is our strength. And we stand together, we strengthen each other. The Torah learning that we do gives us the koyach that Hashem invests in us. This Shabbos is Shabbos Chazak, V'nis Chazek. So that's what's going on in the calendar. It's big deals. We are going to move from here to talk about what's going on inside the Parsha, not just the calendar. And here we have Parshas Vayechi. Short recap of more or less where we're up to. So the last time we discussed, it was a good few weeks ago, we discussed the brothers being born. The brothers grew up, and Yosef being the favorite, the son of the favorite wife, and the favorite child, Yosef, spends an enormous amount of time learning and spending time with his father. His father makes him make soinis pasim. The brothers get jealous, and eventually they're so jealous that they originally going to kill him, throw him into a pit, and then sell him off to be a slave. And the Parsha then continued to say that he went down to Mitzrayim. He came down to Egypt, sold as a slave, gets framed by his master's wife, ends up in jail, and there interprets the dreams of the butler and the baker. And then 10 years later, 12 years later, after he was framed, he is remembered by the butler. When Pharaoh has his unsolvable dreams, and there's this Jewish lad who is locked away in the dungeons of Mr. Potiphar, he knows how to interpret dreams. And Yosef comes out, interprets the dream perfectly to the Pharaoh's very great appreciation. And he becomes the viceroy, second in command, leader, the ruler of Egypt, directly under the Pharaoh himself, where the Pharaoh lets the whole running of the country in his hands. And Yosef, very, very cleverly, with the gift of Hashem, turns Mitzrayim into not just a superpower, but the wealthiest country in the entire region. And whilst the years of goodness are very prosperous to fall of Egypt, the years of famine are even more prosperous for Mitzrayim, because everybody in the entire region is coming to buy food from the only place, the only source of food, which was going to be 7 years thin. And Yosef has prepped the whole country, and the government becomes wealthier and wealthier, both from the outside incoming money, as well as from all the citizens within Egypt, effectively become subservient to the government. They almost sell themselves. And Yosef does a deal where he introduces the concept of VAT, of taxes, of where everybody, whatever you earn, 20% of what you earn is tax. Very reminiscent to the tax man in this country. And Yosef establishes that for years to come. And this becomes how Pharaoh's and the government's income, steady income, whatever goes on in the country, is just feeding money into the coffers of the government, and they're doing extremely well. It was in this time that the brothers come to buy food, and Yosef takes them on a little ride, last week's Parsha, until eventually he spills the beans and tells them, I'm Yosef. I'm the guy who you sold as a slave. I'm the viceroy. You're here to bow down to me, just as I predicted in my dreams. but bring father here because father is obviously suffering for the 22 years he hasn't seen me. It must be very difficult for him. Let's make sure he's comfortable. Bring him down ASAP as soon as possible, which is what the end of last week's parsha is. Yaakov comes down to Mitzrayim to live in Mitzrayim next to Yosef after meeting the Pharaoh and blessing him and describing how he's had not had an easy time. Finally, Yaakov's life is going to have a peaceful stretch, the end of his life. He was 130 years old in last week's parsha when he comes down to Mitzrayim. And that's where this week's parsha opens up. In this week's parsha, Vayechi Yaakov, Yaakov lives it up in the land of Mitzrayim, far away, down south, away from the holy land of Canaan, of Mitzrayim, of Yisrael, where he had lived all his life, besides when he had gone for his wife for 20 years there. And here, Yaakov, with the promise of Hashem, had come down to live in Mitzrayim, and he has fantastically happy days. His whole family's around him. He sees the nachas of all his descendants, including Yosef, who had not spent time amongst the sheltered home of his father and family. Instead, he'd been thrown into the depraved, unholy place of Mitzrayim, and yet he had brought up the next generation in a state of holiness, in a level of focus. And this, if I can get that to work, it would be helpful. Yeah, we got it. And it's at this stage that Yaakov comes down. Yaakov, who's down in Mitzrayim, asks Yosef to come down to visit him. And in this part of the parsha, Yosef is summoned by his father, and his father says, "Look, I'm getting older. I'm not so young anymore. I want to make sure that it's clear and obvious that I do not want to stay here in Mitzrayim after he passes away." Instead, he asks Yosef to swear and take an oath that when Yaakov passes, he will right away bring him back up to the land of Yisrael and to bury him in the same burial place where his wife Leah was buried and where the forefathers Abram and Yitzchak had been buried there as well, in the cave of Machpelah in Hebron. And Yosef agrees, and that part is settled. Later on in the parsha, when Yaakov is not only feeling old, he actually turns ill. And when Yaakov is ill, so the messenger comes to Yosef and says, actually, your father is not just old, he's getting ill. And it's a good idea for you to go visit. So Yosef right away comes to his father together with his two sons, Menashe and Ephraim, who he brought up in Mitzrayim, and he brings them to his father for a blessing before his father would pass. And it's at this stage that his father, Yaakov says to Yosef, not only am I going to give your two sons a bracha, I'm actually going to do what Hashem promised me. I'm going to extend the 12 tribes that I have, the 12 sons who are going to be the future families, the tribal families of Bnei Yisrael. They will now become, Menashe and Ephraim will be upgraded. Instead of being the descendants of the tribes, they themselves will become tribes. In other words, instead of having one Yosef, we will have two Yosef, Yosef A and Yosef B, Menashe and Ephraim, because these boys are so special. They will take the bracha that Hashem had promised me, that it would be Goyo Kahal Goyim, that I will have multiple tribes to be added to what I have already. And that's when Yosef and his sons get the next level bracha, where they're not only going to have blessings, but they will actually be upgraded to the next tribes. It's interesting that Yaakov mentions to Yosef, if you were to have any more children going forward, they won't have this type of bracha. They will have to be included into their brothers' tribes. But for these two boys that are already born to Yosef, Menashe and Ephraim, Keruv, Mishim, and Yehuli, they will be upgraded. And then later after that, the Parshah describes that Yaakov talks to each one of his sons, not just Yosef, starting from Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, and each one of them gets a last will and testament from the Reuven, Shimon, and Levi get a bit of rebuke, and then on each one of the tribes get a bracha that is specific to them. And what's fascinating is that these brachas are very similar to the same brachas that the tribes will get when there are major big families of thousands of people each from Moshe Rabbeinu in Moshe Rabbeinu's final days, which is also a fascinating, interesting idea, where these brachas aren't just nice wishes, they are very much connected to what each tribe's mission will be. My computer's playing dances. Okay. Later, after the story, Yosef eventually passes away, and all of the brothers carry the bed of Yaakov's coffin, and they travel. They walk up from Egypt all the way up north to Eretz Yisrael, and the way they carry the Aron is the same setup that years later their great great grandchildren will travel when they go in the same desert, when they're going on a very similar journey from Mitzrayim up to Eretz Yisrael. It was in a much more roundabout path, but the formation of where the tribes would be in the same way. They bring them up to Ma'aras and Machpelah, and the basic reading is that they bring them there and they bury them there. Of course, Rashi mentions that it wasn't so straightforward. There was trouble. Esav came to block them and to say, hold on, you can't have the space. He's taken one side of the cave Machpelah for his wife, the other side should be for me. And eventually there was a bit of a hoo-ha, and Chushim sorted the story out by whacking Esav and moving him out the way. The end of the Parsha ends off by saying that Yosef as well, together with all the brothers, eventually all, over the due course in time, pass away. So Yaakov Avinu is 147 years old when he passes. Yosef, years later, is 110 years old when he passes away. And when Yosef passes away, he instructs his descendants and those who remained that they should also take his body out of Egypt and bring him back to Israel. However, it's different. Yosef tells the people, you should know that we are supposed to be down here in Mitzrayim for now. For now. But the time will come. Hashem will come and take us out of Egypt. And at that time, when Hashem sends the Redeemer to take us out of Mitzrayim, that's when we will all leave as a nation. And it's at that time that I want you to pass on the promise that everybody who lives should tell the next generation that they should make sure to take out his bones, Yosef's bones, from Mitzrayim and bring up with them when they leave. And they swear to Yosef that's what they're doing. Yosef passes away and is buried in Mitzrayim. And that actually becomes the closing verse of the entire first Sefer of Bereshis, that Yosef is buried down in Mitzrayim. If I remember correctly, maybe last year or the year before, we spoke about beautiful sikha about why we would sing Chazak Chazak over Yosef being left behind in Mitzrayim. I mean, the final verse, there's no nicer way to end off an entire book of the Torah with Yosef getting stuck in Mitzrayim. Not only that, if the Parashah would have ended one verse earlier, one pasuk earlier, it's talking about how Yosef lives on to see generations from Manasseh and Ephraim, and they're all going the good path, and it's a fantastic, beautiful ending. Yet the Torah decides to add one more pasuk. It almost ends it on a downer, it would seem, but Yosef got stuck in Mitzrayim. Not only that, the Rebbe asks that verse of Yosef getting stuck in Mitzrayim would be a perfect, it would make sense to include it in the beginning of next week's Sedra, the next Sefer that talks about the hardships of Egypt. One of the hardships is that Yosef also got stuck in Mitzrayim. So why would the Torah choose to include this in Parshas Vayechi, include in Sefer Bereshis, and then make that part of the down almost in the beginning? And of course, the answer is, as the Rebbe makes a very big point, that Yosef stayed back in Mitzrayim because he became the symbol of being able to navigate and being able to transform, to work with the exile mentality, the exile reality, the golus, the hardships of Mitzrayim. Yosef was excelled in being able to navigate it. From when he made it down there, he transformed Mitzrayim into a place that would be able to become transformed, be able to be elevated. And therefore, Yosef staying down in Mitzrayim is actually a source of strength to all those who remain. And as the Rebbe tells us, it's the same source of strength to us today, knowing that Hashem invests tzaddikim in our generation that become the source of our comfort, energy, focus. In our days, with our challenges, when we go to the lower hemisphere of the world, if you like, further away from Eretz Yisrael, and yet we still have tremendous tzaddikim that we can go to. The Rebbe spoke about the Friedrich Rebbe's oil, and the Friedrich Rebbe's name was Yosef Yitzchak, and being able to go to the Rebbe, to be able to get a bracha, is part of this promise, over which we say Chazak, Chazak, V'nis Chazek, when we travel to the Rebbe, When we write to the Rebbe and we ask for a bracha, we know that Hashem is listening, and the Rebbe, the Tzaddik, gives us brachas that we can succeed in the mission that we have until we all go back to Eretz Yisrael, Be'ezus Hashem Meher V'Yameinu. So that's the chazak of this week's parsha. Let's talk about a particular sicha that is in Chelik Chaf Hey, which is in this week's project of sichas. I'm going to start off with asking the following question. In the Rebbe's words, the Rebbe was once asked about why he makes people, he asked himself, why he incessantly insists on making people crazy about Mashiach. And the Rebbe would talk about it in those terms. He says, I don't let go. I ask for Mashiach, I make everyone around me talk about Mashiach, and it's not just one time, over and over and over again. And here's the question. Why do we keep begging for redemption? Aren't we overdoing it just a little? And besides, put on your Yiddishkeit hat, doesn't this demonstrate ingratitude for our many blessings? Shouldn't we be singing Mizmor L'Soida, thank you Hashem, instead of talking about what we want Hashem to do further? And here is the question, what's up with Mashiach? Help me out.
I think it's so we don't get complacent.
Whoa, okay, very good, good angle. The more we talk about Mashiach, the more we recognize that however good thing is, we should not be complacent. I like that angle. Everyone want to add to that? Agree, disagree?
No, I agree with Rochelle. If we don't talk about things, we forget about them.
Keep on the front burner. Absolutely, absolutely, yes, very much so. And I think borrowing, we're gonna go use that. We're gonna go down that path, and we're just gonna add maybe a few words to that based on the sikha, that keeping in front and center is not just important that we shouldn't forget about it. It's actually because everything about all the accomplishments and all the goodness and blessings that we have really boil down to one major measure. This is the barometer to understand whether we are headed in the right direction. Which means that first of all, we're not going to let go, we're not going to settle for second best. But it also means it reminds us why all the blessings we have are so good. Because they're driving us towards this most important destination. So it's not only that we're ignoring the blessings, we're refocusing why these blessings are so blessful, and also reminding us that all the brachas that we have are there to drive us towards this one and only major destination. Everything else is just a cog in the wheel driving us towards there. So all the other brachas and the many brachas that we are thankful for, and we should mention because they keep us going, are keeping us going towards this one most important destination. So we're going to learn this. We're going to learn from this week's Parshah. We're going to learn how Yaakov versus Yosef turn into, in the Sicha's words, Yaakov with the power of Yosef. Teach us how to do this. And it's going to be almost like the brachas that we have, the gratitude that we have towards all the good things are the Yaakov element, the Yosef element, and the insistence on the Geula is going to be the Yaakov element, and each one is absolutely necessary. And when they work off each other, then we have a golden path that we want to focus on. And what it's going to teach us is how to be able to see brachas and be thankful, and at the same time never stop asking Hashem and demanding and begging Hashem for Geula. Let's do it inside, bit by bit. The opening part of the Sikha talks about before Yaakov passes away. Before his death, Jacob made Joseph take an oath, a shvuah, to bury him in Israel and not in Egypt. I'm just going to put into context. Yosef as well is also eventually buried in Eretz Yisrael. Till this very day, Cave of Yosef is in Shechem. It's a bit tricky to get there. You need a army convoy these days, unfortunately. And when Shechem was handed over to our cousins, the first thing they did was destroy the whole caver, even though Yosef is considered one of their prophets. It's not so much the topic of conversation. But Yosef is clearly buried in Eretz Yisrael. But Yaakov says to his son, don't bury him eventually in Eretz Yisrael, right away. Yaakov did not want to be buried, even for a short while, in Mitzrayim. He didn't want to be buried at all in Mitzrayim. As soon as it's over, arrange for me to go back to Eretz Yisrael. And under oath, Yosef agrees to do what his father asks from him. Let's see it inside. As Yisrael, as Israel, Yaakov, by the way, the name Yaakov and Yisrael are in this week's Parshah used interchangeably, sometimes in the same pasuk.
Yeah.
It says Yaakov Yisrael. It's the same. And of course, your Kabbalists will explain to you why each time each word is used in a particular reference, but we're going to use the words interchangeably. And Yisrael, as in Yaakov, stays near his passing. He summoned his son Yosef and said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, please place your hand under my thigh. Treat me with loving kindness and truth. Do not bury me in Egypt, even for a short while. I will lie with my forefathers, and you will carry me from Egypt and bury me in their burial place." Yosef replied, "I will do as you ask." "Yes, yes, father," says Pasuk 31. And he said, as in Yaakov says further, "Swear to me." And Yosef swore to him, and all Israel prostrated himself on the head of the bed. And as it actually says, the head of the bed is where the Shekhinah rests, and that's why he bowed into the head of the bed. So what we have here is that Yosef gives his word, and Yaakov says, "Please don't just give me your word, please swear to me." Okay, the question is going to be, there's a question we've heard, especially if you learn Chumash Rashi, why did Yaakov insist on an oath and not accept Yosef's commitment alone? What was missing in just having a commitment? Yosef was a man who kept his word. What else did he want besides? Why did he want an oath? And for this, we have, starting from a quote from Kuntres Mayan from Rebbe Rashab, the power in an oath. He says, Chassidus, when you take an oath, no obstacle can stop you, and you are compelled to get it done. How so? Says the Rebbe Rashab, an oath marshals our concealed intrinsic powers, and once these are activated, nothing can stand in our way. As our sages say, nothing stands in the way of the will. The sheer willpower that is activated, by an oath is the power to not get stuck for anything. So, to put that into simple English, Yosef says to his father, "I will do it. You have my word." And his father says, "Good, appreciate it, but I need you to be more invested in this than even your word. An oath awakens deep inner strength, an unwavering resolve driving us beyond our usual limits." Says Yaakov to his son, "We're going to need more than just your word. I need you to be able to be not only really want to do this, but to be so invested that nothing can stop you." Obviously, he foresaw that there might be reasons that would try to stop his son Yosef from carrying out his word, and therefore, using his foresight, he encouraged Yosef to not only give his word, but to actually take an oath. He asked him once, and then he insisted on asking him deeper to get an oath out of him as well. As the Ramban writes, this is not because he didn't think Yosef was an honest guy, or Yosef didn't care. Yaakov did not suspect his righteous, beloved son would disobey his father's instruction and his own words, "I will do as you ask." He clearly trusted Yosef, yet Yaakov asked for an oath to make it difficult for Pharaoh to refuse. Pharaoh might want to keep Yosef in Egypt and tell him to send Yaakov with his brothers and servants, or worse still, Pharaoh might insist that the prophet Yaakov be buried in Egypt, bringing honor and merit to Egypt. So one level would be he would say, "Yosef, you don't leave. You don't bury him. Let someone else bury him." Or worse still, don't bury him up in Egypt at all. Pharaoh could all of a sudden turn around. Yaakov was the prophet who turned around Egypt with his blessings. And he was a big guy. And Pharaoh might say he wants him to stay. And forcing Yosef to take an oath would make the Pharaoh hesitate, because asking someone to betray their oath is wrong. Says the Ramban, even the Pharaoh would know that. Being bound by an oath will also force Yosef to try harder. Actually, says the Ramban, "V'chein hoya hadavar," and this is precisely how it played out. So, to answer our question, why did Yaakov insist on asking a second time, not just for his word, but also for an oath? Yaakov knew that Yosef would face many obstacles, and the oath gave Yosef the transcendental power needed to overcome all opposition. Okay? We've had a question, we've had an answer. This is pretty much included in Chumash Rashi. Says Zicha, let's lay it in now, let's take it to next level. Let's keep pushing. Question. Why does Yaakov ask Yosef to take an oath a second time? It's almost like the first time he asks Yosef, he says to him, give me your word. And then he asks him again, give me an oath. It's like, yeah, almost like there's two layers to the request. Now, if it was just plain Chumash, you could say, well, it's not such a difficult question. Fair, fair. The Chassidus is going to zoom into this. Somehow, the Pasuk split the request into two separate psukim, with an answer of Yosef in between and a second layered request. And the two layered request, Chassidus is going to explain to us, is actually engaging two different challenges that Yosef would face. One request answered by Yosef's words. A different layer of the request, dealing with a different layer of challenges that Yosef would face. That layer needed to have not just Yosef's words, but an oath. And what we're going to realize is that although Yosef could face all sorts of challenges from Paro, his word was strong enough to insist on every obstacle. But there was actually a spiritual reason, a godly reason why Yosef might have argued to keep his father Yaakov down in Mitzrayim, at least for a while. And it's for that Yaakov made him take an oath. And what we're going to learn is that by making an oath, Yosef to Yaakov, that oath is going to create an unbreakable bridge from Yosef to Yaakov. All of Yosef's holy work that he's going to continue to do and invest in Mitzrayim will forever be bound, connected, and attached to Yaakov's position and holiness and his efforts. That was the oath. The oath was going to create an unbreakable connection, not just to be able to deal with obstacles that Paro might throw at them, but even from a spiritual level, even from an idealistic perspective. That was the oath. The way we're going to do it is we're going to analyze the difference between Yosef versus Yaakov. And we're going to first explain how they are so different and how their lives were different. Their investment into Mitzrayim, into the Golus, was very different. And we're going to learn that Yaakov appreciated Yosef. Yosef appreciated Yaakov, even though they had very different lines of work. And once we've established their differences, we'll then realize how special it is of this oath, bridging and connecting these two different types of service, two different types of approaches, and that what it means to us is that as we navigate our challenges, we are the future of Yaakov plus Yosef. And as we work towards changing our reality to bring our Geula, our redemption, our destination, we are using both these elements. And that's why we insist on demanding Mashiach every day, all day, and at the same time walk around empowered by the brachas we do see to continue doing both of these efforts, which could seem like contradictions. They're really not. They're two sides to the same coin. Here we go. Question time. Why did Yaakov choose to be buried in the Holy Land, leaving his children behind in Egypt as slaves? Why did Yaakov feel it was the right thing to abandon his children? Why was it clear to Yosef that he would be buried in Mitzrayim as long as his family and all of Klal Yisrael down in Mitzrayim, compared to Yaakov Avinu himself, which tells his family the minute he passes on, move him out of Mitzrayim, move him back immediately, immediate return, you can't stick around. And this is a question that's highlighted if we compare what happened to Yaakov compared to what happened to Yosef. But before we do that, let's read what the Zohar asks. Rabbi Yossi Omar, Rabbi Yossi said, given that Yaakov knew that his children would be subject to exile in Egypt, why was he not buried there so his merit could shield his children? Question mark. Why did he want to escape Egypt? Is it not written, Kerachim of Albanim, as the father has compassion for his children? Where was Yaakov Avinu's compassion? Question mark. And this is the question Rabbi Yossi asks in the Zohar on Yaakov Avinu we're describing here. It almost seems like Yaakov Avinu jumped ship. He is Yaakov Avinu, the patriarch of all the people who died in Mitzrayim. Yet the minute his life's over, he leaves. And he instructs them to make sure to do right away what's going on. So Rashi has the basic answer, the simple pshat answer. Rashi says, quoting the pasuk, "Do not bury me in Egypt," says Rashi, 3 reasons. Number 1, its soil will become infested with lice. And the 3rd plague, swarming under my body, and Yaakov was not in the mood of having his body bitten by lice. Number 2, when the dead come back to life during the resurrection of the dead, Tchias HaMesim, those buried outside of Israel will endure pain of rolling through subterranean tunnels to Israel. And therefore Yaakov says, don't bury me in Chutz La'aretz. And third but not the least, I don't want the Egyptians to turn me into a deity. They are certainly going to turn Yaakov's burial plot into a place of worship of idolatry, because Yaakov had done tremendous amounts to saving and turning around Egypt. And therefore he says, rather than risk that, please don't bury me in Mitzrayim. Each one of these 3 options are answers into themselves, simple level, level, and level. But what's interesting about all these 3 answers is the answers focus on Yaakov, why he would rather not be there. How was this best for his children who were going to remain there? The fact that he wouldn't have lice would be beneficial to Yaakov, but how's that going to benefit his children? The fact that Yaakov's body wouldn't have to roll if there would be Tchias HaMesim before he got transferred, that would be beneficial to Yaakov, but how does that help his children? And the same with the deity. If he could be beneficial to his children, why would he want to abandon them? Clearly, Yaakov Avinu is also taking into account his children, Kirachim Ababanim, the compassion a father has for the children, and therefore the Zohar's question stands. But the answer is also very powerful. The answer we're going to learn by first contrasting to what Yosef lives. Yosef told his brothers, I will die and God will surely remember you and raise you from this land to the land he promised to Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Says Yosef to his brothers and their families, you can't leave Egypt yet, but the time will come. Shem will say it's time to leave. There will be a Geula. And Yosef insisted on an oath from the children of Israel, saying, Hashem will surely remember you, and at that time you shall take my bones out of here. So Yosef chose to be buried in Mitzrayim, but instructed that his remains be taken to Israel during the Exodus. It would seem like Yosef got it straight. He doesn't want to get stuck in Egypt for whatever reason, like we mentioned about Yaakov, but he appreciates that as long as Klal Yisrael is there, they need him to be present. It only strengthens our question, what about Yaakov? Why did Yaakov not say this? So Rashi has a simple explanation, and he says in Parshah you could say, Yaakov knew that nobody could get him out of Egypt besides for Yosef. Yosef knew what strings to pull, and therefore he felt okay asking his son to arrange for him to be transferred, because he knew Yosef could do it. Yosef looked around, and he realized that none of his brothers had the connections that would be needed to get Yosef's bones out of Egypt. And therefore he didn't ask. So on the simple level, Yosef said, I was ruled over Egypt and had the authority to bury my father in Israel. But if the Egyptians will prevent my children from doing the same for me, they're not going to be able to pull this one off. Therefore he made them promise that they would take him along when they left. Okay, simple pshat. But actually, in the Chassidish pshat, Chassidish teaches it's much more than that. Yosef remained in Egypt to support and uplift his people. And this is the sikha that we're going to quote here. Yosef was buried in Egypt, unlike Jacob, who was buried in Israel, to empower the Jews, while still in Mitzrayim, to overcome the exile and control it, rather than being controlled by it. The Yidden, whilst in Mitzrayim, should be able to control their circumstances. This made it possible for them to leave Egypt. In other words, when Yosef says, when you leave Egypt, take me out, he was telling them the way you're going to be able to leave Egypt is if you stay on top of the exile. And that power will come from Yosef staying behind, being buried in Mitzrayim. So we now see that Yaakov insists that he cannot remain in Mitzrayim for some reason. Yosef insists in staying in Mitzrayim because this will be a support to his descendants. And we're already starting to see that Yaakov and Yosef have very different approaches to how to deal with in Mitzrayim reality, how to engage an exile, a hostile, unholy environment. And here we'll put on the screen some of the compare and contrast. So whilst Yaakov was spiritually refined, so spiritually refined, he couldn't bear the impurity of exile, Yosef had a different approach. His spirituality was strong enough to transform exile from within. And we're going to say that it's not the same. Yaakov was extremely holy. Yosef's spirituality was extremely powerful. Yaakov was abstract, removed from engaging in the here and now, almost above, whereas Yosef was able to descend into and transform from within. Equally, Yaakov lives down in Mitzrayim. He lives far away from the glitzy lights and the depravity. He lives in a place where it was a Jewish ghetto, Goshen. And that's where all of them lived, including Yaakov, which wasn't close to Yosef. And when he wanted to speak to Yosef, Yosef had to travel to go to that side of Egypt where he would meet inside the Jewish quarters his father Yaakov. Compare that to Yosef. Yosef found meaning and purpose in making Egypt into a place of holiness. He lived in the capital. He was the center of the scene. And that's where he brought up his family as true, holy, and ideal family inside the doors of Mitzrayim. And that's why also Yosef is asked for an oath to ensure his burial right away. Don't leave me behind in Mitzrayim, because Yaakov can't handle Mitzrayim. He can't settle in Mitzrayim in any shape or form. Whilst he's there inside a bubble. Burial? No chance. He can't be settled, fixed into Mitzrayim. He's only there inside a safety bubble, a safety protection, whilst he's in Mitzrayim. He's not really there. He's from above. Compared to Yosef, Joseph chooses to remain in Egypt, even in death, to inspire the exile nations, because this is what Yosef is about. Yosef is about engaging, working from within, and Yaakov is about wherever he is, he remains aloof, above, and doesn't get dragged into the realities of Galus. Now, between Yaakov and Yosef, which one is more realistic? Which one's more effective? Which one is the path that's going to really transform? We would lean on saying Yosef. Yosef is willing to go into Mitzrayim. He's there. He can handle it. He's not going to get bogged down. But actually,
No, it's Yaakov.
Yaakov is the one who can be down in Mitzrayim and not get affected at all, because he will not bring down the walls of his protection. And the minute it's fixed, if you're talking about burial, no chance. Straight away out of Mitzrayim. What we have here is actually, and we're going to learn that although Yaakov and Yosef seem so extremely different, Yaakov comes down to Mitzrayim when Yosef is there. And then when he knows that Yosef is there, and Yosef invites him to come to Mitzrayim, he comes down to Yosef. And Yosef knows that when his father passes away, he's going to bring his father up to Mitzrayim, to Eretz Yisrael, sorry, because when he does that, that is where he's going to have the clarity, the path, the trajectory of where he needs to take everybody who's remaining behind in Mitzrayim will be dependent on knowing that Yaakov is in Eretz Yisrael safely in Ma'aras HaMachpelah. And I'm going to learn that that connection needed to have reinforcement. And that is what the oath is going to do. Let's see how the Sikha builds us up. Yaakov couldn't truly live in exile. While in Egypt, he stayed in Goshen, a Jewish enclave protected by Yosef. But after Yosef's death, after Yaakov's death, he needed to return to Israel. Which explains what we're saying here. Yaakov asked Yosef a second time to take an oath because, unlike Yaakov, who could not endure exile, Yosef thrived in Egypt and was committed to transforming it. And therefore, the first request that he says, Yaakov, Yosef, give me your word that I won't get stuck here, I won't be buried here in Mitzrayim. That was, Yosef, make sure you deal with all the challenges, whether your power makes you a hard time, or they try and bury me here because I'm going to be a prophet. You take care of that. And Yosef says, yeah, you got my word. And that would have been fine. The second request says, Yaakov, there might be internal resistance. You, Yosef, on your spiritual path of transforming Mitzrayim for the sake of Hashem, you might have ideas that would say that keeping Yaakov down in Mitzrayim would be beneficial even for a time until the Yidden leave. And for this, says Yaakov to Yosef, I'm asking you again, make it stronger. Make it clear in your mind that I need to go to Eretz Yisrael right away. Don't get any good ideas. And for this, I need it to be also on the level of an oath. Let's see how the Sikha puts it in here. Starting off with the Gemara in Maseches Nida that talks about an oath. This is quoted in Tanya. What is an oath? Just like we're using this, we'll do this quickly. The Gemara talks about when a soul is not born yet, is made to take an oath. What is the oath of the angels administered to the fetus unborn? Be righteous and not be wicked. What use is there to tell an neshama, a soul, to take an oath to be righteous and not wicked? The soul wants to be righteous anyhow. It's not born yet, has no idea. Why would you make it take an oath? Says the Rebbe Rashab again. The Hebrew word shavua can also be from the word seveya, to satisfy and to make full. In other words, when Hashem makes us take an oath, that satisfies and fills us up with the energy that's needed to carry through the commitment. And that's exactly what happened in our case here. The oath our soul takes before birth empowers us to overcome the desire of the animal soul. The same was what Yaakov was doing to Yosef. He says, Yosef, you were on a mission, and you're going to do whatever you can to fulfill that mission. I'm going to empower you to never lose sight that Yaakov should not be buried in Egypt. Yaakov should always be in a protected space outside of Mitzrayim. You still have to do your mission because that's what you have to do, but Yaakov has to be back in Eretz Yisrael with the power of an oath to insist that it remains that way. And this is what we find, a similar type of idea about why Yaakov Avinu felt like he couldn't be there. Yaakov didn't abandon his children. Why does Yaakov insist that he cannot be in Egypt? He went to Israel to pray and empower their future redemption. So while Yosef remains in Egypt to guide and inspire them during exile from within, Yaakov's not deserting them. He is going to be the enabler from outside to be able to make sure that the liberation in the future will be secured. Is two-pronged approach. On the one hand, we need Yaakov on the outside, and at the same time, we need Yosef on the inside. We'll talk about Yosef's empowerment from the inside in a moment. But first, let's go back to ask ourselves, why do we need a Yaakov on the outside? Why do we need to have an anchor that is safely implanted in pure holiness, unengaged and unburdened with the troubles of Mitzrayim? And with the anchor, we can then focus on Yosef. So here's a fascinating Gemara that talks about, oops, I'm going the wrong way. The Gemara talks about a very interesting story. Reb Chia fell ill. Reb Chia was a very great scholar, and Rabbi Yochanan came to visit and asked, do you enjoy suffering? What a question. Reb Chia replied, I don't like suffering and I don't like its reward. Rabbi Yochanan said, give me your hand. He gave Rabbi Yochanan his hand and was miraculously cured. Later, Rabbi Yochanan fell ill. And Reb Chanina came to visit Rabbi Yochanan. And he asked him the same question he was asked. He said, Rabbi Yochanan, do you enjoy suffering? Yochanan replied, I don't like suffering and I don't like its reward. Rabbi Chanina said, give me your hand. Rabbi Yochanan gives Rabbi Chanina his hand, and Rabbi Yochanan is miraculously cured. Interesting, right? So they each did it for each other. As the Gemara, interesting. Why didn't Rabbi Yochanan cure himself? If he was able to cure Rabbi Chanina last time round, can't he cure himself? And here comes the famous quote. Evidently, this is what people mean when they say, prisoners can't free themselves. Ein chavush mater atzmei mebeis asurim. In order to extradite oneself from a difficult situation, we need outside help. The Jews needed someone from the outside of Egypt to lift them out of slavery and exile, a spiritual anchor beyond their confines. So important for us to remember. We are on a mission. We didn't necessarily choose to be on this mission, and we wish it was over. But we also know that Hashem is counting on us, as are hundreds of generations behind us, because our generation is the generation of Geula. And we have been given what it takes to do this final steps that are going to complete all of history. And the power has been given to us. But Yaakov needs to be outside of Mitzrayim. We need to be anchored in someone which is outside of the schmutz and the schwerigkeit and the troubles. We must remain connected to a source and an anchor that's outside of it. Who was outside? Who knew what Mitzrayim was like? Yaakov Avinu says, bring me back to Eretz Yisrael. Make sure I'm firmly planted and buried there so that I can continue to send energy and become the securer to enable the future redemption. And that was Yaakov not abandoning his children, but ensuring that his children would have what it takes to break free. Because Yaakov, from his perspective, or better said, for his line of service of Hashem, is to remain aloof and undragged into the schmutz, and from there be able to send the outside energy needed. It's Yaakov's investment. And at the same time, Yosef from within will continue to give us inspiration. Yaakov's presence in Israel anchored his children to a higher identity, helping them access the part of the soul untouched by Egypt, which in turn allowed them to engage from within Yosef's style, because they were always anchored to something which was beyond and without, from out. And this is what the Sikha tells us inside. Yaakov had to transcend Egypt's culture and power. Whilst he was there, he lived in Goshen. He never got involved into the engagement of grappling with the schmutz. He also needed to bind Yosef with an oath to come out of Egypt. He had to make sure that there was connection would never be severed. This is how Yaakov lifted and bound Yosef to his level to be exalted above Egypt. This is implied by his instruction to Yosef to take him up from Egypt. Yosef enters in a covenant that will forever bridge his service of being what you might call in the real world, dealing with reality as we know it, dealing with the challenges of not becoming anxious from regular life, dealing with not letting life dictate how our moods are. That's not easy. And it means very much engaged. But that sort of service, that avodah, that effort must be always anchored in a clarity of Yaakov being outside of all. In Yiddish, we say, atafachecher. There has to be a side of me that is always connected and is free from any of this schmutz or schwerigkeit. There has to be a section, a corner in my life, in my space, in my mind, in my heart. And that corner, everything else that's happening outside is exactly that. It's outside. For me, for who I am, I'm pure. I'm always part and connected to Hashem. I'm buried and planted into Kedusha and Eretz Yisrael. In turn, this then enables Yosef to channel this transcendence over Mitzrayim to all Yidden, so that Hashem's promise to Yaakov, I will surely lift you, would come true for all the Yidden, that the people will be lifted from submission to Mitzrayim. So what's the power that's going to allow Yosef, and by extension all the people in exile, in Mitzrayim, and equally today, what gives us the koyach to be sure that we are winning and we're never going to lose? And as dark things seem to be happening all around us, we don't lose faith, we don't lose hope. We have the absolute clarity because there's a side of us that the power of the oath keeps us absolutely attached and firmly planted in pure Eretz Yisrael. That's what Yaakov established. First of all, he made sure that Yosef is going to take him up. And then he said, Yosef, remember, this is a dual-powered mission. On the one hand, it has to be absolutely Yosef that's going to drive us to the finishing line. But Yosef must be anchored in what he's going to do for Yaakov, firmly plant him into Eretz Yisrael. Let's just read it inside. Yaakov's longing to leave Egypt, despite his comfort there, teaches us. Yaakov had a lot of blessings in Mitzrayim. Remember, we said this was his happiest years. 17 years full of nachas, comfort, whatever you wanted. Begashmus uberuchnis. He had all his family around, he had all the comforts, and he was serving Hashem like never before. Yet he longed to leave Mitzrayim. Teaches us that no matter how prosperous we can be in exile, it can never be our true home. We might be doing tremendous accomplishments. We might be Yosefing all the way through, transforming one after another. We are full of brachas. There's so much going well. There's so much we can say, look how well we're doing. Look at this accomplishment. Look at this structure. Look at this change and good achievements. All of those achievements should never shadow the clarity that we need to know what it is that we're looking to achieve from day one till the very end. And that is what Yaakov teaches us. Yosef's on a mission, but that mission is absolutely anchored. We want Mashiach now. We want to be in Eretz Yisrael. We want to be back with the Beis Hamikdash. We want to be in close embrace with Hashem and only Hashem. And therefore, our continued tefillas, our praise for redemption, reflect an awareness that only then can we fully live as who we are meant to be. So we learned two opposing things. On the one hand, we've been talking about that the challenges of Golus don't get us down. And now we've just learned the end of the Sikha is that the successes we find in Golus equally don't let us lose sight of the goodness. This is Yaakov's two-leveled request from Yosef. Don't let the hardships get in the way. That's level one. And that's there. Yosef's going to back us up. He's going to give us the koyach, and we're going to be successful. But then Yaakov says, don't let the successes, the accomplishments that we managed to achieve whilst we're still in Golus, distract us from what we really need. So when we say thank you Hashem for this bracha, for that bracha, for this fantastic achievement, don't let that blind us. And we don't lose the forest for the trees. We don't make as if. We don't lose sight what it is that we're looking to achieve. All these warm-ups are here to bring us Mashiach now, and we are on a mission. We are on the winning team. We have the Yosef power, and more importantly, we have the Yosef and the Yaakov power. We will do it. We're on a mission. And Be'ezras Hashem, this week, tonight, we should hear the Geula, take of Miyad Mamish, with all the best brachas, beheir of Yameinu now. Thank you very much for joining, and have a good Shabbos. Chazak, chazak, v'nis chazek.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.